Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. Bill Piper's with us. He's the National Affairs Senior Director for the Drug Policy Alliance. And we're talking this morning about Attorney General Jeff Sessions' plan to crack down on the growing, selling, and use of marijuana. Good morning.
Good morning.
And first, what is the Drug Policy Alliance? What's your mission? How is your group funded?
Yeah, so we're the nation's largest organization working to end the war on drugs and treat drug use as a health issue instead of a criminal justice issue. And we have, several 100,000 members. We get some foundation money, money from a variety of different individuals.
Now, as you know, Attorney General Jeff Sessions next week is expected to release a report that about criminal justice reform. And drug policy advocates fear widely that he's going to try to link marijuana to violent crime and drug trafficking. He wrote a letter to Congress explaining his point of view. He writes this: I believe it would be unwise for Congress to restrict the discretion of the Department of Justice to fund particular prosecutions, particularly in the midst of a historic drug epidemic and potentially long-term uptick in violent crime. The DOJ must be in a position to use all laws available to combat the transnational drug organizations and dangerous drug traffickers who threaten American lives. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, I'm not surprised because he's been a long-time supporter of the war on drugs. But Congress just last week, the Senate Appropriations Committee passed an amendment prohibiting the Justice Department from spending money to undermine state medical marijuana laws, and that's something Congress has passed several years in a row. So he's kind of, and President Trump himself on the campaign trail said states should be able to set their own marijuana policy, and that he supports medical marijuana. And the former press secretary Sean Spicer just confirmed that position a few months ago. So for us, the question is, who's in charge? Is it Attorney General Jeff Sessions or the president? If it's Attorney General, then we might be facing some sort of crackdown. But if the president keeps his word, then at the very least, they're not going to undermine at least medical marijuana.
Yeah. And explain how marijuana policy works in the U.S., because it's restricted at the federal level, but then states have different laws based on medicinal or recreational use. So how does that all work together?
Yeah, so 29 states have legalized marijuana for medical use. 8 states have legalized marijuana like alcohol in that they tax and regulate it and establish age controls, et cetera. But under federal law, any amount of marijuana for any reason is a federal crime. So we have two systems that coexist at once. It's important to note that, constitutionally speaking, the federal government can't make states make things a crime, and it can't force states to arrest people. So there's a lot of leeway for the states that the federal government can still come in and make arrests, but they don't really have the resources to do that on a large scale.
So when you're walking the halls of Capitol Hill speaking with members of Congress, what's the elevator pitch? What do you tell them about why weed should be made legal?
Yeah, well, I usually say that the polling is very clear that the American people believe states should be able to set their own marijuana policy, and that they don't necessarily need to decide the issue based on should marijuana be legal, should it not be legal. This really is an issue of states' rights. It's also an issue of racial justice, given the enormous disparities in arrests at the local and state level. I find the argument that there's very little the federal government can actually do to stop states from doing this to also be pretty effective.
You talked about the public polling on this. This is from CBS News. It's pretty clear here. Question, this is conducted by CBS News in April of 2017. The question is marijuana use should be, and you see here legal 61% as compared to not legal, which is 33%, and the support for it has ticked up over the years, as you can see here. Let's go to the phones. We have Rick calling in from Annapolis, Maryland. He's a Republican. Rick, good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
All right, thanks. So what's on your mind? What do you make of this?
Okay. I just wanted a comment from Bill. When I worked in D.C., they interviewed the top principal of one of the local high schools who had a 40% dropout rate. And so they asked her, what was the problem here, you know? And so she said, well, you want me to call these young black boys into the auditorium and tell them they need to stay in high school and get a high school diploma so they can go out and be like manager of McDonald's and make $35,000 a year. You know what they told her? What are you, crazy? We can go out and sell drugs like marijuana, make $300-400 a day. So she said I couldn't compete. So, Bill, what are the consequences for people that sell drugs and make a living? Don't make it a medical issue. I'm talking about the dealers. Should there be consequences for selling marijuana, heroin, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, as long as there is a demand for marijuana, there's going to be a supply to meet it. Someone's going to sell it at some price. The thing about drug prohibition, just like alcohol prohibition, is it makes these substances far, far more expensive and profitable than they otherwise would be. We also have to look at the other side of the equation, that we have millions of Americans, tens of millions actually, who have been arrested for possessing or selling a substance, who now have a criminal conviction, which makes it hard for them to get a job, hard to get housing. It's something, conviction follows them for life. So it's ultimately really not, you know, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. One advantage of legalization is that it takes it out of the underground and puts it into a regulated environment that, you know, where you can regulate the marijuana, tax the marijuana, establish age controls. And then we're hoping that states, and California is a good example of this, where voters just approved legalization in the last election. They are earmarking the money to, you know, treatment and education, et cetera, but also reinvesting it in the communities that have been most affected by marijuana and the war on marijuana. And, you know, it's just a lot cheaper to spend money on prevention and housing and jobs and other things than warehousing people behind bars.
Some information here from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and it says, how does marijuana affect a person's life? Compared to those who don't use marijuana, those who use heavily more often report the following: lower life satisfaction, poorer mental health, poorer physical health, and more relationship problems. I'm not quite sure how they quantify all that, but what's your initial reaction to that?
I mean, causation doesn't mean correlation. So if someone's doing bad in school, et cetera, you know, they may be more likely to break the law generally, and thus may be more likely to use marijuana. There's no actual evidence that marijuana causes brain damage or any number of things. But ultimately, marijuana, it's like alcohol or anything else. You know, you can abuse it, and we need to do a better job of educating kids. But to blame social ills that largely stem from poverty and broken families and a whole number of issues on marijuana is just, it's a cop-out, and policymakers like that cop-out so they don't have to address the other issues.
We're talking with Bill Piper about some of the policy issues surrounding legalizing marijuana and the Attorney General's push to crack down on it. The line for Democrats, we want you to call in, is 202-748-8000. Republicans, call 202-748-8001. Independents, call 202-748-8002. Let's go now to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where Nick is on the line for Democrats. Good morning.
Turn it up, Tom.
Nick, you're on the line.
Good morning. How are you?
Great, thanks.
I'd just like to bring up the idea or the fact that we need to attach violence and violent crime in association with alcohol and alcohol abuse in this country. Blaming marijuana for all the ails and the problems, I think a lot of people have been around this for a long time, a lot of knowledgeable people. It's affected people's lives in ways. Everybody's different, but the conversation they're having here, without including alcohol, and the problems and abuses that causes and it has caused in society. Bringing up prohibition before was the right thing to do. Anytime that something is prohibited the way it is in this manner for hypocritical, racist, and class reasons is no way to set policy or to do anything regarding this issue. It should be taken off of the Schedule I class of drugs. It's not in the same class. And the idea, the fellow that called before about the race and the black people, white people, Hispanic people, Asian people, people all the world. This is a product that's grown naturally all around the world. You don't have to process it. You don't have to do anything with it if you want to use it. If you don't, you don't have to. But when something is like this, it's so natural in nature, it must have a reason and a purpose for being there. Nothing else around has to be, can be utilized in a fashion without it being processed and without it being taken from one substance or one thing and turned into another. You can't just pick barley, wheat, and rye and go and drink it. You have to process it. But for me, the big thing is here, there's much more violence associated with alcohol in this country than there ever will be with marijuana and marijuana users.
Yeah, I agree that there isn't alcohol is in many ways more troubling than marijuana. The research shows that people who drink, driving under the influence of alcohol is far more dangerous than driving under the influence of marijuana, though people obviously should not drive on either. There does seem to be a correlation, at least, with domestic violence, and people using marijuana have a lower rate of domestic violence than people who use alcohol. Police say that the level of violence at an event that involves drinking, such as a sporting event, the violence is far greater than at an event, like a smoke-in or something like that. So, marijuana, and on top of it all, there's no amount of marijuana that a person could smoke that would result in a fatal overdose, whereas people can suffer from alcohol overdoses that are fatal. And in fact, most of the opiate and heroin overdoses that we're reading about in the news involve alcohol. And that's not to say that alcohol should be prohibited for the same reasons that you mentioned. Prohibition doesn't work, but it is hypocritical to focus on marijuana but not alcohol.
The Marijuana Policy Project has this map here of all the different states that have eased restrictions on marijuana, ranging from having laws that allow for medicinal marijuana to ones that tax and regulate marijuana in ways that are similar to the way they tax and regulate alcohol. You told me during the break that your group was really key to Washington, D.C., the district here, relaxing some of its marijuana restrictions. How has that gone so far? What are the results?
Well, the arrests for marijuana possession are down, and so that's a plus. And D.C. had some of the highest marijuana arrest rates and some of the hugest racial disparities in the country. Most marijuana use was occurring in Ward 1, which is where Georgetown and is a very affluent district, but most of the arrests are down south of the river. So, we're really glad that happened. Unfortunately,
and down south of the river is comprised of who, mate?
Oh, it's largely the black population in D.C. And certainly a higher rate of lower income than Ward 1. And so, even though the use rates were higher in the affluent districts, the wars clearly was fought in certain communities. And when we ran that campaign along with DCMJ, a local group, we found that a lot of voters, especially in the lower income communities, were very concerned about the long-term impact of marijuana arrests on people's ability to get jobs and loans and et cetera. Unfortunately, the DC voters passed that, but then Congress prohibited the council from taxing and regulating marijuana. So we have a weird system different from Colorado and California and other states. that we have legal marijuana, it's legal to possess, legal to grow, but the underground still exists because Congress is standing in the way.
Let's go back to the phones. We have Tanya calling from Martinsburg, West Virginia on the line for Independence. Good morning, Tanya.
Good morning. I want to start by saying on June 28th, I got through the C-SPAN, and sometimes your phone people ask, what is your comment going to be? Well, they didn't like my comment, so they hung up on me. And I tried many a times to call back in recent days on this subject, and they wouldn't let me through. Last night I got a new phone number, and now they let me through. Well, I called the Better Business Bureau. If I be the first and only one to file a complaint on C-SPAN, I will. And I called the ACU because I felt like my freedom of speech was at jeopardy.
Tanya, well, you got through now, so what's your comment? Do you have a comment on the segment we're talking about?
Yes, I do. And my comment that day was, it's a shame that everybody wants to be so sensitive about the opiate use and have so much compassion, which I'm not against. But what people who smoke marijuana or do other kind of drugs, they have to be thugs. They have to be locked up. My comment that day would have been, why don't the budget people put all the money for the opium and the marijuana addicts in the same pool to expand it and not try to be cute by protecting the opium users. Even in Ohio, they showed where a police station has set off a corridor to give emergency treatment for patients with the opium addiction. People who smoke marijuana don't get that kind of compassion.
You raise a very good point. And if you look at the war on drugs itself, it really escalated in the 1980s when the popular image of who smoked crack was, that it was an inner city African-American thing, even though a majority of crack users were and are now white. And, with the spread of opiates and pain medications, et cetera, we see a lot of policymakers that have a far more compassionate approach to that drug because of the media image of the opiate or pain medication user as being white and rural. And so there's no doubt that policymakers have adopted more progressive, compassionate policies for opiates than some of the other substances, including marijuana. And a lot of that has to do with race and the image of who's using it.
We have a tweet here from someone who writes, marijuana is brain poison. Federal law says it's Schedule I controlled substance, and we're going to enforce the law. And then he uses the hashtag Make America Great Again. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, we've been enforcing the law for, decades, and 30 million people have been arrested for marijuana, and it's still widely available. And regardless of the person's personal concerns, states are moving forward with legalization. 8 states have legalized marijuana like alcohol, and more states are going to legalize marijuana in 2018, 2020, and beyond. So we're past the stage of should marijuana be legal, and we're at the stage of how should we legalize it, and what's the best way.
One more tweet and then back to the phones. Thomas Shipman writes, would legalizing drugs hurt the cartel's power in Mexico and Central America?
It might. We definitely have seen with the legalization of medical marijuana in California and some of the other states that decreased the profits of the cartels. And I suspect that legalization of marijuana across the board in the U.S. would take away all the revenue that the cartels receive from marijuana. Now, of course, cartels are into a lot of things, other substances, kidnapping, extortion, etc. But if we could take away the marijuana profits, that is at least hurting them.
Well, one more tweet here because this is an interesting one. Jim at Lake Gaston writes, Mr. Piper, are federally chartered banks still apprehensive about opening accounts for authorized marijuana outlets?
Yes. They're very afraid that they're going to get slapped with money laundering charges or something like that, even though there's never been a case of the federal government going after a bank for accepting money. It's become a huge problem in the states that have legalized marijuana because in addition to not having a hard time depositing money, they have a hard time doing payroll and other things that require a bank. And as a result, a lot of the transactions are in cash, which makes it hard for the government of those states to know how much money people are making, to track it, to regulate it, to tax it, etc. And this has started to become a big issue in Congress, and even some members of Congress that oppose the legalization want to do something about the banking issue because they realize that it's a public safety issue. They're dealing in all cash. It makes them a magnet for robbery. Police officers in some cases are worried, because it's an extra risk to them to have to show up to a scene in which there's possibly armed robbers, and it's just not at all necessary, and it's not going to stop states from legalizing marijuana. And I suspect that that's going to be changed in the coming years.
Let's head to Merced, California. On the line for Democrats, we have Gus, who's been patiently waiting. Thanks for your patience, Gus. Gus, you there?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, yep.
Okay, perfect. I just had a quick question for Bill. I was wondering how exactly removing this illegalization of marijuana would affect the mandatory minimum sentencing of other drugs, such as cocaine and all that. And to piggyback off of that, how would it affect police officers' ability to use civil asset forfeiture on vehicles and such when they could smell marijuana?
Well, it definitely would eliminate the mandatory minimums for marijuana offenses. By itself, it wouldn't necessarily affect the mandatory minimums for the other substances, but it's important to note that the long-term trends in the polling shows that voters believe the war on drugs has failed and they want change. And in addition to there being a bipartisan consensus in Congress for letting states set their own marijuana policy, there's a bipartisan consensus in favor of reforming or eliminating mandatory minimums generally. So, it's not directly, but I think it'll happen. As for asset forfeiture is probably one of the biggest reasons that police oppose legalization, because marijuana is an excuse they can use to seize people's money, houses, cars, etc. And legalization of marijuana would make it harder for police to use asset forfeiture, which in many cases is related to marijuana.
Bill Piper is the National Affairs Senior Director for the Drug Policy Alliance. Thanks so much for being with us. Coming up, this week's